Hey everyone, and welcome. You know, for thousands of years, we've had this really complex, really fascinating relationship with cannabis. So how did we get from these ancient sacred rituals all the way to modern science and dispensaries? Well, in this explainer, we're going to go on a global journey with this plant. We're going to trace its path from deep history right up to the cutting edge of what we know today. Let's dive in.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start by digging into the plant's ancient roots. Then we'll uncover the pretty amazing chemistry behind traditional edibles and sacred smoking rituals. After that, we'll get into the modern science of how it all works in our bodies, hear from a few surprising cultural icons, and then wrap it all up with some really crucial wisdom for today's world. All right, first up, let's really get a feel for just how deep our relationship with this plant goes. And I'm not talking about decades or even centuries here. We're talking about millennia. This is literally one of the oldest crops humans ever decided to cultivate.
Now, what's so fascinating is the huge difference in how it was used. For thousands of years, in places like Neolithic China, cannabis was all about practical stuff. You know, hemp for making rope, seeds for food. The idea of using it for its psychoactive effects, that came way, way later. And it was mostly localized in parts of Asia. It wasn't until after 1500 that the high THC varieties really started traveling the globe on big trade routes. And that changed everything.
This brings us to the incredible art of the edible. I mean, think about it for a second. With no modern labs, no fancy equipment, ancient cultures totally cracked the code. They figured out the complex chemistry you need to make cannabis work when you eat it. It's this amazing story of basically trial and error science. Bhang from the Indian subcontinent is the perfect example. It's been used for over 3,000 years, and not just for fun, but as a truly sacred plant. Ancient texts like the Atharva Veda even called it a liberator, a source of happiness that could, and I'm quoting here, release us from anxiety. So how did they make it work?
And this is where their genius just shines through. Take a look at step 2, sauté in ghee. Now ghee is just clarified butter. It's a fat. By heating the cannabis in fat, they intuitively figured out the two scientific keys to a great edible. Decarboxylation, that's using heat to turn on the THC, and lipid solubility, binding it to fat so our bodies can actually absorb it. They knew that it worked long before we knew why it worked.
And get this, it wasn't some one-off discovery. Half a world away in North Africa, you find Majoun. And what's at the heart of the recipe? Infusing hashish into fat or honey. It's the exact same principle, discovered completely independently. This stuff was loved by poets and mystics looking for inspiration, and it all came down to that one piece of knowledge. Fat is the key.
Okay, so let's pivot. We've talked about eating it, now let's get to the most dominant way it's consumed, both back then and today: inhalation. And this is so much more than just a delivery method. For so many cultures, it's a path to spiritual connection and a huge part of their identity. Just look at the Rastafari movement. Ganja is the holy herb. It's a sacrament used in groundation ceremonies to connect with the divine. But it's also so much more than that. It became this powerful symbol of resistance and cultural identity against what they called Babylon, the oppressive colonial establishment. So the very act of smoking was both deeply spiritual and deeply political.
And just like they did with edibles, these cultures had this incredibly sophisticated understanding of potency. This traditional Indian grading system, it's basically a perfect map of cannabinoid concentration. They knew that the leaves, Bhang, were mild. The female flowers, ganja, were stronger. And the pure resin, charas, was the strongest of all. I mean, they had figured out phytochemistry just by paying close attention.
So that brings us to the modern science that explains, well, everything we just talked about. Why is smoking a joint such a profoundly different experience from eating a brownie? It all comes down to the journey that the compounds take through your body.
On the surface, the difference is pretty simple: speed and endurance. When you inhale, it's fast. You feel it in minutes, and it lasts for a few hours. When you ingest it, it's a slow burn. It can take up to 2 hours to even kick in, but that experience can last for up to 12 hours.
Okay, now here is where it gets really cool. When you inhale, THC goes from your lungs straight into your bloodstream and to your brain. It bypasses the liver. But when you eat it, it takes a detour. It goes through your stomach to your liver first. And your liver does this thing called first-pass metabolism, where it converts the regular delta-9 THC into a completely different and way more potent compound, 11-hydroxy-THC. That's the game changer. And this is what creates what we now call the edible paradox. You've got the super long delay before you feel anything, and when you finally do,
the effect is supercharged by that more potent molecule. That combination is exactly why edibles are the form of cannabis most likely to lead to someone taking way too much and ending up in the ER. It's a huge public health challenge that we all need to understand.
So how did this conversation around cannabis move out of the shadows and into the mainstream? Well, a big part of it was thanks to some very influential and maybe surprising voices.
Take the brilliant astrophysicist Carl Sagan. He wrote anonymously at the time, but he didn't just defend cannabis, he framed it as a potential tool for building a better society. He argued it could help produce things like serenity, insight, and fellowship, qualities he felt the world desperately needed. It's just an incredibly powerful intellectual argument for the plant's potential.
And then you have an icon of innovation like Steve Jobs, who straight up linked his cannabis use to the mindset that fueled his work. For him, it wasn't about escape, it was about getting into a state of relaxation and creativity, a state he felt was essential for, thinking differently and building the future.
Okay, so let's bring this all home. How do we take thousands of years of this incredible cultural wisdom and blend it with cutting-edge science to create some real, practical advice for today?
If you take away only one thing, let it be this. The method dictates the experience. It's the absolute crucial point. The ancient makers of Bhang knew this, and our modern science charts prove it. How cannabis gets into your body changes absolutely everything.
So what does that mean in the real world? For edibles, to avoid that whole edible paradox, the science is clear. The recommended starting dose, especially if you're new to it, is just 2.5 milligrams of THC. The golden rule is, and always will be, start low and go slow.
Now, for inhaled products, the risk is different, right? Because the onset is so fast, you can self-titrate. You can feel the effects in real time and decide when you've had enough. To maintain that control, the general recommendation is to stick to products with no more than 10% THC. But, and this is a really critical piece of modern research we just can't ignore, when we talk about long-term, chronic, high-frequency use, the method might not matter as much as we thought. New data is suggesting that the cardiovascular risk, specifically reduced blood vessel function, is actually comparable for both smoking and edibles. The long-term issue seems to be linked to your total THC exposure over time, no matter how you get it.
And that leaves all of us here today with a final big question. As we move forward and shape the future of this industry and this culture, how do we balance the profound ancient wisdom of this plant with our very modern responsibility to ensure safety, education, and well-being for absolutely everyone? Thank you.